Although there is now something beeping outside my... So welcome everyone to the next session in our Teacher, Technician and Advisor workshop series. I'll be handing over very shortly to Richard, who will be leading this storytelling workshop. But firstly, for those of you that are attending this workshop for the first time, my name is Liv and I work in the recruitment and outreach team at NUA. We're really sorry not to be able to welcome you on campus at the moment, but hopefully these online sessions will provide you with some useful resources to take back to the classroom. We're really aware that during this uncertain time, you and your students might be feeling particularly anxious, and particularly those students who are looking at coming to university in September. So we really want to support you and them in the best way that we can. And if you have any suggestions for us, please do let us know. We'll also be keeping you up to date via our latest FAQs on how the NUA community is approaching the COVID-19 situation, and we'll be linking you to those in the chat function. Just some housekeeping bits before we do get going. We'll be asking you to keep your video and your audio off for the majority of this session this morning, just to ensure that it runs as smoothly as possible. There will be moments though where we'd love to hear your thoughts on things, and at those specific points, we'll be asking you to let us know if you'd be happy to share, and you can do that via the chat function, and then we'll facilitate you coming on screen and turning on your audio. We are also recording this session this morning, so if you have any problems with your connection or if you have to leave a little bit early, please don't worry, we'll send you a link afterwards and you can catch up on anything that you've missed. If you do have any questions throughout this morning, Richard will be happy to kind of answer those sporadically, but if you could just pop those into the chat and then I can ask them to him, and we'll facilitate that kind of on a case-by-case basis. But I think that's pretty much everything from me, so I'll hand over to Richard and we'll get going with this session.
Terrific. Hello. Before I launch in, Liv, I'm okay. You can see and hear me before we start? Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. Hi, everyone. My name's Richard Bracewell. I'm too shy to put up a picture of myself, but you can see me. But here's my name. I'm a lecturer here on the film and moving image production BA at NUA. I'm also a practitioner, a director and producer. I directed the Horrible Histories film, Bill, a couple of years ago. I directed and produced that, and I also was the script editor and developed the script with Ben and Larry, two of the writers and stars. You can see them there on the left. That's Ben, King Philip II of Spain, and that's Larry as a slightly less historical Lope Lopez. They were the two writers of the film, and I worked very closely with them to develop the script. In doing so, was able to apply a huge amount, learn a huge amount, and a lot of things that we're going to cover here in this lecture this morning. I'm not going to talk any more about Bill. I'm going to talk about other films, many of which I hope you've seen. As Liv says, do dive in at any point if there's anything you want to ask me, but I will leave time at the end for questions. So if there's anything you want to cover about the content of today's lecture, then please come to me at the end. So once the screen changes, there we go. Telling tales, where stories come from and how they work. That's what I've called today's workshop. Telling tales, where stories come from and how they work. Now, I wanted to start out by saying, just picking up something that Liv said. This is an exercise I've done, or the lockdown script exercise that I cover later in the workshop. This is something that I've done with my own year 2 students here, second year students at NUA. I did this a few weeks ago. We had 60 students in the class. It was an online session similar to this, and I gave them a couple of hours. We only had 2 hours to turn something around, and to my utter amazement, we had about 53, 54 responses from the students. That in the context of a normal sort of a piece of work that you'd set, that is a huge uptake. We had a really fascinating session talking about the work that they developed, and it made me think. It made me see very, very clearly how much a need there was amongst the students to talk about their experiences in lockdown. Now, this was about 6 or 7 weeks ago we did this exercise. Obviously, things have developed further since then. We've got a little bit of distance. This has become a slightly more normal. But I still found that there was a huge desire from students, many of whom had never written before, never written anything, were much happier as directors of photography or sound recorders, but there was a huge urge. So I really feel this is something that is relevant to young people, any age group that you teach. And I feel when we come back into the classroom, whatever setting that is, I do feel that there's a lot to be explored here. And hopefully you will take something away from the exercise that I've set. As I say, we'll have a look at a couple of scripts that were submitted for this exercise later on in the context of this workshop. But I do hope this is something you can take away and adapt to your own students, whatever age they are. Doesn't necessarily have to be film. What we're looking at here is 60-second scripts. These could easily be performed. Require very little in the way of props and costumes. A 60-second script can be performed very easily. A few too many weapons for my liking, and a lot of the work the students put together. But that's students for you. They watch a lot of American and Korean cinema, so some of that creeps in from time to time. But having said that, broadly these things are incredibly practical and can be staged. So I would really, really hope that this is something that you can take away as teachers and mentors. So what we're going to cover this morning, there it is, 3 sections. We're going to have a look first of all at some technical element, some element that every story that we look at, every story has in common, every good story, every story that is worth telling and worth retelling. Then I'm going to go from the macro to the micro. I'm going to have a look at scenes, how scenes work, and more importantly, how to write better scenes. So when a student brings you a 60-second page or 1-page scene, how can we improve their work without substantially rewriting for them? How can we improve their own work whilst keeping their intentions the same? And finally, just to come full circle, I'm going to answer the first question at the end. I'm going to say, where do stories come from? Liv, I just got a note there on the chat. Someone couldn't see the presentation. Is everyone okay here with the presentation, Liv? You can see it, can you?
I can see it, but
okay.
If anybody else is having issues, do let us know in the chat. And I would
recommend
if you leave the meeting and then rejoin, sometimes it kind of corrects itself. Yeah. So I would try that if you are having issues.
Okay, thanks, Liv. Our plan. So the third element I'm going to cover this morning is just to come full circle, really, and answer the first question last, which is looking more broadly at where stories come from. Where do these stories come from that we all write, regardless of whether we are Hollywood screenwriters or teachers, or we are writing a 60-second scene just to show our friend, or if we just take an image, a photograph, or we make a sound recording and we share that, we are telling a story. Where do these stories originate? And as I think, I hope you will find, and I hope I will show you that in this very strange way, this lockdown environment that we've all been in is a strange opportunity to really make us step back and think about where stories come from, given that we're all coming from the same place. So I'm going to start off by looking at what a single element I'm going to pick out, which I think is incredibly helpful in understanding how stories are structured. And that is one element that all stories have in common. And we have to start, of course, with one of the great stories of all time, which is Where's Spot? Now, you either read this, you had this read to you, or you have read this to others, or heard people reading it to others. Maybe like me, you just read it for fun and include it in lectures on Thursday mornings. Where's Spot? This is a story that we hear when we're very young, when before we can even speak, we are read this story. Where's Spot? And there's a clue as to the storytelling element that I'm looking at this morning. That's the first part of this lecture. There's a clue in the title, Where's Spot? There is something about the title that sets this story in motion. And I'm going to come back to Spot in a minute, by way of something a little more grown up, but not necessarily better storytelling, which is Spider-Man. Here are a couple of frames from the comic. Now, this was the clip that I hope you've all seen. It's probably you've probably seen it on DVD or at the cinema. The clip, hopefully you saw when Peter Parker gets smitten by the spider. Here it is in the original Marvel comic, Steve Ditko, Stan Lee, the storytellers. You might have seen Tobey Maguire, in my opinion, the best Spider-Man. You might have seen his version. You might be much younger than I am and enjoyed Tom Holland or indeed Andrew Garfield. There are a million different iterations of this same story. In the version I played you, that was, of course, Tobey Maguire. Here's the shot sequence, just to remind you if you watched it last week or haven't had a chance to see it. There's the spider, shots going left to right from the top. The spider bites Peter and his transformation begins. Now that and Where's Spot are, in story terms and story structure, are two of the same elements, and that is what we call, in terms of story structure, that's what we call the inciting incident. So at this point, I'm going to stop for a second and put the spotlight on you guys and just ask you if anyone wants to throw in a very brief definition of what they think the inciting incident is. Please have a go, even if you're not sure, or if you are sure, tell me and tell the group. So would anyone like to volunteer? Just a couple. I won't spend too long on it. Anyone like to have a go at defining what this is? I've just shown you a couple. Anyone want to dive in? Amy Lee is saying, what happens next? Feel free, Amy, if you want to unmute and give me more a sort of a broad explanation of that. Jenny Bond is saying an event. Yeah, that's a good start. An event. Guy is saying the stimulus for, I can't quite see the whole thing. The stimulus for the rest of the story. Stimulus is a great word. Someone's just unmuted, which makes me think you want to join in. Who's that? No?
That was Amy. But
that was Amy. Do you want to say a little more about your answer there? Please don't feel you have to. Please feel free just to listen if you want. Call to adventure. I really love that. Amy, I don't want to cut you off in your prime.
I think Amy had unmuted, but I had asked her to unmute at the same time and then helpfully muted her by accident. So
Amy,
I'm very sorry about that.
You want to speak?
Hello, can you hear me?
we can hear you. Yes, Amy. What? Hi, good morning. I always feel like a radio DJ in these occasions.
Hello.
What did you say? Were you called to adventure or an event? What was your definition?
What happens next?
What happens next? Yes, that's a great way of thinking about it. What happens next? How essential is it to the story, would you say? Oh, you've just disappeared. Actually, can you still hear me?
I think Amy may have gone.
I think Amy may have disappeared. I would say yes to most of those. It's a strange term, inciting incident. I'm going to give you my favourite definition. I'd say there's no... Oh, who's... Hello? Who's that?
I think that is still Amy.
Oh, Amy, yeah, you're breaking up, unfortunately, as our end, so...
I think it might be on a delay, so I think this might be what she was trying to say earlier, but has only eventually made it to us.
Oh.
Because as far as I can see, she's muted at the moment.
Okay.
But thank you, Amy, for trying.
Yeah, thanks for trying. Keep listening and see how close you are. I'm just going to reveal my favourite amongst dozens and dozens of definitions that you will read about this storytelling element. And that is the inciting incident. Yes, it's an event, absolutely, as all of you, I think, have identified in your responses. It's an event that puts the forces of conflict in motion. And the key term that I'm looking for here is conflict. Because I've got to understand conflict as the key element, the key component of drama. And it's worth saying at this point that when when we talk about an inciting incident and concept and conflict rather, these are very strong terms, but they're not necessarily. It doesn't necessarily always have to be quite so sort of bangs and whistles. Another way of thinking about an inciting incident is a sort of a gun, like a starting gun firing or a bomb going off. But it could be something as simple as one character coming into a room, someone arriving. Think about Shakespeare. A messenger arrives with a piece of news. This puts the forces of conflict in motion, and also. We're talking about bells and whistles and bangs and explosions. Conflict isn't necessarily a negative thing. When we talk about conflict, we're talking essentially about something that is imbalanced. So there's something that is unresolved that needs to be resolved. Now I'm going to just switch here to a couple of films that I know you've seen, probably all of them. And I know that the cover of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory isn't the film poster, but I couldn't bring myself to include the film poster because I love the book so much. But here we have 4 movies, very Hollywood, that we can just break down for a moment and just apply some of those terms here. Paddington, The Martian with Matt Damon, 4 Weddings, of course, and any version of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. But this works for either the book and the moment I'm looking at here is the golden ticket. So the inciting incident, the starting pistol being fired, the bomb going off, the event that puts the forces of conflict in motion. Now, in Paddington, this is an earthquake that kills his uncle, and as a result, his Aunt Lucy sends him off to sends him off to traveling. He ends up in London, obviously. So earthquake, storm. There's a good comparison between Paddington and The Martian. You might think completely 2 different films, but they begin with an inciting incident that actually are strangely similar. The Martian begins with a dust storm that separates Matt Damon character from his crew. And it's important to notice that without the inciting incident, there is no story. So the inciting incident is put there by the writer to instigate the story, to set the forces of conflict in motion. Let's just stay with Paddington and The Martian for a minute. So I've just written a couple of examples of what those inciting incidents are: an earthquake, a storm. In Paddington, if the inciting incident is the earthquake, what would you say the conflict of the film is that is then resolved? What's the conflict? Let's have a couple of shouts. And I should say before we start, of course, this is film. This is not a science. This is an approximate. This is an approximation. This is a subjective discipline, and many arguments have been had about inciting incidents and indeed conflict in general. But broadly, finding a home, that's great. We can stop there and go home. Francesca has nailed it in one. Yeah, finding a home or finding a family. Or so when you say home, Francesca, we're talking about home in its broadest sense. That's the struggle. That's the conflict. It's not scary. It's a family movie, but it is still a conflict. It's an imbalance created by the earthquake. Isn't the imbalance something? What's unresolved about Paddington is that he doesn't have a home. He doesn't have a family. Without the earthquake, there is no story, because without the earthquake, he doesn't literally lose a family member, his uncle, and he has no reason to leave and go off in search of another family. So the earthquake is put there by the writers of the film to create a strong and clear starting pistol or bomb going off for the story. A nice easy one, The Martian. What's the conflict of The Martian that is set in train by the dust storm? Anyone want to have a go at that? Again, it's don't overthink it. You should get it like that. Yes, escaping Mars, exactly. He's got to get home. You say escaping Mars, more broadly in the sweep of the film, he wants to get home. Without the dust storm, this is just another NASA mission and is of no interest to us as a movie. Maybe you think it's of no interest to you as a movie anyway. I don't know. It's very long. But it is still a story that obeys all the story, all the tenets of story structure. And go to the top right now, looking at 2 slightly different kinds of genre. Obviously, romantic comedy, possibly the romantic comedy that we've all seen a dozen times. The inciting incident here is Charles, the Hugh Grant character, meeting Carrie at the start of the film. It's boy meets girl. And I'm not going to insult you by asking you what the conflict is. The conflict, of course, is that he wants to get together with her, and he does at the end of the film. So resolution is something that can be positive. It's not always positive. It can be incredibly bloody and tragic. At the end of Hamlet, I can't lose track of how many characters do die at the end of Hamlet, but it can be tragic, but it is still resolution. Charlie and Chocolate Factory, of course, one of my favorite inciting incidents, Golden Ticket, more broadly, this is finding treasure. Now, this is a slightly more subjective discussion here about what the conflict is in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I think it's broader than Charlie wants to inherit the chocolate factory. Anyone want to have a stab at that? And I think this is a bit more open-ended. Anyone want to say, what did you say the conflict is that has to be resolved in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Anyone want to have a go at that? Oh, silence, much harder, this one. I'm not sure myself. I think you could give several different answers, I would say. No. Redeeming Willy Wonka, yeah. This is a strange thing about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, that in an odd way, the story is more about Willy Wonka overcoming social injustice, good, bad. Already three answers there that are completely disparate. You look at the way that the film was developed by Tim Burton, and is much more about the redemption of the Willy Wonka character, which is a good indication, perhaps, or possibly growing up. Again, much more difficult, much more subjective, that one. Something to argue about over a pint when the pubs reopen. All right, I'm going to move on now. I'm just going to have a look more broadly. Charlie's changing circumstances. Well, yes, I mean, that's a description of events, certainly. That was Jenny said, that Charlie's changing circumstances. That's certainly a description of events. What we're looking for is a conflict. So the conflict might be, how does Charlie adapt to the change of circumstance? This is a story that's very familiar when someone, for example, maybe someone inherits money and that changes them for the bad. A story like Trading Places, where the conflict is this character going to be able to reconnect to what it is that makes them human? I'm not sure that is the case in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, because I don't think Charlie is changed by the experience that he has. I think he's probably changed for the better. Anyway, already we're down a rabbit hole. So I'm going to move on. So the inciting incident is important to the story, because if story, in its most broadest sense, is conflict which is resolved in some way, the importance of the inciting incident is that it sets up this conflict. It starts this conflict. It sets the forces of conflict in motion, so that we have conflict and resolution. Not, as I said, not always happy resolution. The reason I've started with inciting incident is because so often I read student scripts that have no inciting incident, where there's no clear starting pistol for the drama to begin. And it's a great place to start when you're looking at improving your work as a script writer, but also looking at how to improve the work of others, is this single element to look at, the inciting incident. Because it comes early in the story, and if you get the inciting incident right, very often the forces of conflict and resolution fall into place. So it's a great place to start. Where's Spot? That's the inciting incident. Spot is missing. The inciting incident, where's Spot, is where's Spot. Spot isn't there. Spot has to be found. The exploration of conflict is looking for Spot, and the resolution, of course, because it's a children's story, is that Spot is found. So I'm just going to take a gasp of coffee. I'm going to move on to the micro from the macro. I'm going to talk about writing better scenes. Obviously, I'm going to be looking at how we can apply some of the things that we've just looked at in scenes, and how scenes in a lot of respects are actually micro stories. So going to move on and have a look at a scene from a classic piece of TV, which I hope you've had a chance to look at the clip here. No, and also the script. This is a scene from The Wire, a very short piece of dialogue, a very short scene from The Wire. Police and cop show set in Baltimore. One of the 2 or 3 great pieces of TV drama. Now, in this scene, I've got the script here just to remind you, we find a detective, Greg's female detective, coming to hospital to meet an informant who's called Bubbles. I'll just skim over. Greg's arrives to find Bubbles sitting on a stool next to the unconscious and intubated Johnny. He's a character who never speaks, who is a friend of Bubbles. During the course of this scene, we establish where Bubbles has been. He hasn't seen his police handler for a while, and then something happens towards the end of the scene. This is the entirety of this scene. Beautiful piece of succinct writing. Would someone like to tell me what the inciting incident of this scene? Because this scene is a story in miniature, and it has an inciting incident, and it's not very difficult to find. As I say, look at it, you get it immediately. If you don't worry, but it's not something to analyse. Anyone just want to fire me a response in the chat? What would you say the inciting incident of this scene is? Because it does have one. Without it, the scene doesn't happen. No, much simpler than that, Jenny. Much, much simpler. You don't have to look very far. That's a clue. You don't have to look very far. What is the event that sets the forces of conflict in motion? Getting out of prison, even simpler. No, the friend is unconscious. Yes, these are all important in the broader sweep of the story and this episode. But the friend is unconscious. Much, much simpler than that. You're going to kick yourselves when I tell you. Yes, Jonathan's really close. The cop, Greg's and Bubbles meet. Even simpler than that. Meeting again, Francesca. You're nailing. You're almost nailing it down here. You're getting closer. Read the first line of scene description, and read the first two words. Read it now. Read it to yourself, or read it out loud if you're in an empty room. First two words of the scene description. So that the first line is the scene setting itself. Greg's arrives. That's it. That is the inciting incident of this scene. See, it's not that difficult. The trick is actually to find it, because it's often, as Lope Lopez says in Bill, it's often hiding in plain sight. Oh, that's the other character. It's often hiding in plain sight, and it's there. But the trick is that it's hard to find because you're so used to it, because you think to yourself, a character arriving in a scene, that's something that has to happen. Well, you know that happens. Well, yes, it does have to happen, but it's not there until the writer puts it there. The writer has put it there, and this is such extraordinary writing because of its directness and simplicity. This is a professional working at the height of their game, and for them it is enough to say Greg's arrives, i.e. the character enters the room. That's the inciting incident. Without the character entering the room, there's no drama. Because without the character entering the room, Bubbles, the other character, is sitting in the hospital ward, watching his friend. Now, for all we know, he may well, in the real world, have been standing there watching his friend for about 5 hours. But because, as Hitchcock said, drama is life with all the boring bits taken out, then the writers don't show us the 5 hours of Bubbles deciding to make the call and ring his police handler. They don't show us that. They show us only what is essential to the drama. And the inciting incident is Greg's arrives. It's there. You see, it's simple stuff when you start to unpick it, and often the answer is much, much simpler than you think. What's the conflict here in this scene? Some of you have alluded to it. Just ping me a couple of thoughts here. What's the conflict? And there's a conflict, I'll give you a clue. It is between the two characters. What's the conflict? And now you've got a sense of sort of how simple this is. A couple of you alluded to it already, actually, in some of the answers you gave earlier. What would you say the conflict is in this scene? Someone have a stab at it. Drug culture. That's the broader thematic conflict of the location. Yes, Amy, that's really good. I'm going to come back to that. That's not quite what we're looking for at the start of the scene, but yeah. Well, Bubs, give info again. Oh, that's good. Getting closer, getting much, much closer. Yeah, that's close enough, I'd say. Let me tell you, the conflict here is, where has the handler been? Bub's changing. Yes, that's very good. We'll come back to that. Jenny, hang on to that, because that's a pretty close answer. Just keep those two in mind. So have a look here. The conflict in this scene is that the detective arrives, and we learn from this scene that her informant hasn't actually been in touch for some time. So the conflict is, where has he been? So if you watch the way the scene is handled, it's very cool between the two of them. That's quite a passive-aggressive line here at the start when Greg says, "They're here." That's why I'm pointing the mouse. "I thought you were still locked up." And she's saying, "Where have you been?" Why haven't you been in touch? Now tell me, this conflict has a resolution. Tell me where it is. It's in the scene descriptions. It's 2 words. Now you're going to get the hang of this, I think, having spotted the inciting incident. This conflict is resolved. Just ping me a couple of answers by the chat again. There are 2 words in the scene description that resolve this conflict. Where's Bubbles been? Greg's is angry about this. Where's he been? The deal. Pretty good. Again, Jenny, you're jumping ahead. I'm going to come back to that. So remember that. Make a note of that. The conflict, where's Bubbles been, is resolved. Anyone want to have a stab? Renewing acquaintance. Yeah, Linda, that's really, really close. They do renew their acquaintance. So I'm going to jump on actually because Linda, you're close enough. The conflict is resolved when Greg's nods. And it's as simple as that. Greg's nods. And what's the purpose of Greg's nodding? Greg's is saying, that's okay. I don't mind that you haven't been in touch, that you've been gone. So the conflict here is, where has the informant been? And they have a brief conversation. The conflict is explored, and then the cop nods to say, yes, I understand. So if we just remind ourselves that story is an inciting incident, in this case, it's the cop arriving. The conflict is, where's the informant been? And it's resolved because the cop says, that's fine. I accept that you've been away for whatever reasons you have. Now, going back to, I think it was Jenny's point, there's something else happens in this scene, which you've all spotted by now. And that's the fact that there is a second conflict at the end, which is that Bubbles has information. Several of you have mentioned this in the feedback you've been giving on the chat. It's there at the end of the scene. So if you look at this scene structure, it actually has a second piece of a conflict at the end, which is Bubbles has information. He has drugs information. So you will see time and again with a scene, that a scene is a miniature story. It has an inciting incident. It has conflict and resolution, but it's a story with a difference. It's a miniature story that has conflict, resolution, and then it has a new conflict at the end of the scene. This is how scenes work, and this is how they differ from stories. Again, I'm teaching you or telling you or drawing your attention here to things that will help you improve the stories that your students bring to you. If you think of this basic structure, the way that scenes work in TV particularly is that you will have a piece of conflict, it will be resolved, and there will be a further conflict right at the end of the scene. Now, you know this because you watch EastEnders and you watch Coronation Street. You possibly even watch Breaking Bad or The Sopranos. And it is the difference in TV and the way that long-form drama structured in TV between serials and a series like The Office or Black Mirror, Fawlty Towers or Community there. I'm sure you've seen one of those, if not all of them. A serial is never ending. A serial is open-ended. And a scene works very similar to a serial. If you think of a scene at the end of Coronation Street or EastEnders, for example, these stories never end. They can't end because they have to go on for months, years even, decades in the case of Coronation Street and EastEnders. So, and this is a definition of a serial in TV, that is essentially a story that never ends. It's a nice comment that I came across from Lee Child, the thriller writer, who described what writing thrillers was like, writing scenes in thrillers. He described it as, you ask a question at the beginning of the book and you absolutely self-consciously withhold the answer. And that essentially is what we're looking at when you write a scene. You have conflict, a resolution, and then you have a new piece of conflict or information introduced at the end of the scene. So with that in mind, I'm just going to spend a bit of time now doing something slightly different. Give me a couple of minutes here. I'm going to swap screens. I'm going to look at 2 of the scripts that were submitted, interpreting this lockdown in 60 seconds. I'm just going to share a screen. So I've got 2 scripts to look at here. We might do 1, might do 2, depending on how much detail we get out of 1. Now, these are scripts that were submitted by students in response to this task. Describe what lockdown means for you in 60 seconds. This is the script exactly as submitted. And what I've done, slightly different here, I've opened it in what's called Final Draft, which is a screenwriting program that 99% of the industry use in the UK and in Hollywood, which is it's like Word, but it's specifically designed to lay scripts out in an industry accepted format, which is what you see here. So at the top, this first line, you will see the setting. It's either interior or exterior. This should really include a day or night. It's an afternoon game, so I'm going to add day. And what I'm going to do here, I'm going to script edit this work on screen in front of you. So you see how a script editor would come to a piece of work like this and would apply some of the rules and the structure that we've just looked at to improve the work. And what we're trying to do here when we script edit someone else's work is not to tell our own story, but to help them tell their own story more effectively, more efficiently. So I'm going to take the script apart and on the screen in front of you so you can see how it works. And what I'm hoping is that the writer's intentions will remain the same, but by applying some of the techniques that we've looked at this morning, we can make this work more effectively as a drama. So I'll read it very briefly so you can just get it in your head. So this is exactly as a student submitted it to me. You can see how relevant it is. I know you're not all based in Norfolk, but here we go. He's a big Norwich City fan, the student who submitted this, I know. The scene is Carrow Road, which is where Norwich play. Bill and Barry, so two characters, walking down Geoffrey Watling Way on the way into the stadium. There's lots of excitement. Bill says, "This is the life." Barry says, "It's not the same without Sarah." Bill puts his arm around Barry and attempts to comfort him. "I know it's hard. She would enjoy the game." Barry sniffs, "Yes, I guess you're right." Into the stands we go. So there's a change of scene here. Bill and Barry find their seats. Barry places a rose on Sarah's old seat. Little speech from Barry. He says, "All good things must come to an end, but all bad things can't continue forever. Farewell, my love, until we meet again someday somewhere." Very romantic, this student submission, rather. Amen. Bill says, "Amen." And then the stadium announcer announces, "The team's in the tunnel. Let's make some noise and make this day one to remember." "What's your prediction?" says Bill. Barry says 2-1 Norwich. Pookie to score the winner. Pookie is a Norwich City player. The stadium announcer says it's time for the oldest football song in the world. Bill and Barry join in with the crowd. The stadium announcer says the ref has blown his whistle and we are underway. So, seems to work, doesn't it? We kind of understand where we are, understand who these characters are. How can we make it work better? Well, when I read this, I instantly, and I've picked this example particularly because you will find time and again that with the 60-second script, you will find that the writers, or just by instinct, because we know story structure so well, the writers will get the right elements in the script, but as Morgan Wise said to Andre Previn, not necessarily in the right order. So all the elements will be there, and a lot of the work that you do as a script editor is to restructure the elements that are already there to make the story work more efficiently. And the key element that I think that is in the wrong place in this script is when Barry says it's not the same without Sarah. Because the moment we hear that information, we realize that there's a third person missing. And there's no more drama. There's nothing more to learn in this scene. So the first thing that I'm going to do, I'm just going to switch to it slightly. So you have to bear with me. It takes a little bit longer to do this. There's a bit of a time lag. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this. As you see there, I'm just cutting this. And I'm going to move this somewhere to the end for now. So it's not the same without Sarah. I'm going to come back and tidy it up in a minute. So Bill says, "I know it's hard, but she would want you to enjoy the game." I quite like, it's not the same. So this is irrelevant now because we're not going to introduce Sarah at this point. So Barry sniffs. This is a great little scene description, this parenthesis, because it tells us that something's wrong. Barry's upset about something, either that he's got hay fever. We don't know yet. So I'm going to change this and say something slightly more elliptic. Cool, there we go. Not the same, is it? Which just says to the audience, something's up, but I'm not quite sure what it is at this stage. So if I move that to here, do you see what I just did there? So Bill says, this is a life. So Bill is a character that has not a care in the world. What's my inciting incident here? My inciting incident is that they are walking towards the stadium. It's no more complicated than that. And at the end of this first scene here, we assume they reach the stadium because when we cut to them, they're already. So that's the inciting incident and the conflict is that they are walking towards the stadium. Will they get to the stadium? They get the stadium. So as you can see from this excerpt, inciting incident and the conflict are not always malign particularly. It's simply the case that you have two characters who need to reach the stadium. That's the conflict. They need to literally make a journey to reach the stadium. But what I'm actually doing in this scene is I want to seed the idea of, remember we talked about conflict resolution, seed the idea of the second conflict, which is the fact that they are missing someone. Their friend has gone. Presumably they've died. This friend, this third person that they always go to the football with. I'm going to make that my third conflict. My second conflict. So I go conflict resolution, and I introduce this conflict at the end of the scene. So what I want to do is give a bit more colour to the scene. So I'm going to move these. I'm going to cut these two lines here. What's your prediction? And I'm going to move them to the top of the script. And I'm going to make that all into all Barry's lines. So, because this is really, these two lines here, this is just color. This is color for the scene, just background detail. So Bill says, this is life. What's your nonsense score prediction? So I'm going to cut that. What's your prediction? 2-1 Norwich Pookie to score the winner. We can imagine them walking with the crowd. But we want to tell the audience that not all, something is up, not all is as it seems. So I'm going to just say here, add a scene description. I'm going to add Barry looks upset. Sniffs, not the same, is it? Bill puts his arm around Barry and attempts to comfort him. And they reach the stadium. We know they reach the stadium because when we cut to the next scene, they're in the stands. So this is my first scene complete. The inciting incident is they leave for the stadium. They're on their way to the stadium. It's no more complicated than that. Will they get to the stadium? Yes, they do. But this dialogue here, the purpose of it is to set up the second conflict at the end of the scene, which is the fact that their friend is missing. Now you'll notice from the scene we looked at before from The Wire that the second conflict generally will come as late as possible in the scene, ideally at the very end. So I don't want any stadium announcer having the last line of the scene. The last line of the scene is so important in TV. The line that you cut out of tells you more than anything else. So Bill and Barry find their seats. Barry places a rose. This fantastic scene description, Barry places a rose on Sarah's empty seat, is fantastic, but it's in the wrong place because it immediately tells me what the answer to this question that I've asked, which is why are they upset? So I'm going to move this down to somewhere down here. How do I know it's Sarah's seat? This is a classic example. The writer knows it's Sarah's seat, but the viewer doesn't. All I know is it's a seat. There's a seat missing. So I'm just going to say it's an empty seat. Bill and Barry find their seats. I want to tease the audience with a little bit more detail that will make this final line work. It's not the same without Sarah. This final conflict which introduces a new conflict. So I'm going to tease the audience a bit more. I'm going to say Bill and Barry find their seats. I'm going to say there is an empty seat between them. So they find their seats. There's three seats. They sit in two of them, and there's an empty seat between them. So immediately, what I'm doing there is I'm showing the audience visually. I'm giving them a visual. And now students are particularly bad at this. They want to tell the audience everything in the view, everything in dialogue. You will find that as writers improve, they like to do less and less in dialogue in terms of giving the audience information. And here what I've done is I've given the audience information in pictures. So these two men, Bill and Barry, find 2 seats, or find 3 seats, and there's an empty seat between them when they sit down. And then Barry launches into this beautiful homily: all good things must come to an end, all bad things going to leave this dialogue, because this feels to me like it's quite personal to the writer. He says, Amen. Bill says, Amen. Barry places a rose on the empty seat. I think that the scene is coming to an end at this point, and I don't now want to be reminded that we're into a football game. So I'm going to move the stadium announcer, because this essentially is this is detail, this is background detail, this is colour for the scene. So I'm going to move the stadium announcer here. The teams are in the tunnel. Let's make some noise and make this a day to remember. Too much dialogue here. The teams are in the tunnel. This is a lot. In reality, probably this dialogue will continue as the characters spoke. But I'm just going to trim this. So I said the team's in the tunnel. It's time for the oldest football song in the world. So 3, 2, 1. We know that the song will continue. So the song continues. What I've done here is the song continues as Barry and Bill say their piece. So I've moved the less important elements, which is the stadium announcer. I've moved that away from the end of the scene. Bill and Barry join in with the crowd. And this is probably, it's not the same without Sarah. We know it's not the same without Sarah. I want to keep this line if I can, but I want to make it slightly harder hitting. So rather than say it's not the same without Sarah, I'm going to use this line simply to give the audience the information that they need, which is, who is this? What's the name of this person that's missing? And I'm going to keep this final line, this final scene description, Bill and Barry join in with the crowd, because I'm a bit soft-hearted, and that gives us a rather more positive end. So just to read the second scene, Bill and Barry find their seats. There's an empty seat between them, so we know something's up. There's this colour for the stadium announcer. Then we learn what this the nature of the second conflict is, which is that Barry then tells us that they're missing someone, and he and Bill say goodbye. Farewell, my love, until we meet again someday, somewhere. Amen. Bill says amen. Barry places a rose on the empty seat, and he says goodbye, Sarah. So finally we know who Sarah is. If you wanted to make the scene more open-ended, you would cut that line, because if you see, with that line in, Bill and Barry join in with the crowd, there is a sense of the scene being resolved. It suggests that Bill and Barry are happy, they've come to terms with their loss. If you remove that line, goodbye, Sarah, the scene is more open-ended. And this is where the second conflict essentially has been introduced. Here, just to give you the thing on the whole screen. The second conflict is introduced, which is this person is missing. Why is this a conflict? It's a conflict because we don't know who she is. There are 2 men, and then there's one woman. Who is she? Is she a sister? Is she the partner? Is she the wife of one of them? Maybe she's the partner of both of them, or maybe she's, I don't know, I don't want to impute anything to Bill and Barry. Maybe she's the partner of one wife and she's having an affair with the other. Anything could happen. The point is, anything could happen. So it creates a sense of drama by ending Goodbye, Sarah, that now makes you want to keep watching. And this is how TV drama works, in the conflict resolution, conflict structure for a scene. And this is what you're looking at when you read student scripts. You are looking for a clear inciting incident, could be a character entering, and then there's some element of conflict that's resolved, and then a new element at the end of the scene, a new conflict is introduced that propels the story forward, and in TV terms, makes you want to come back next week and keep watching. I'm going to just close that. I'm just going to open a second script very quickly and do a slightly quicker version, as we haven't got much time. And I'm going to have a look at and I'm going to do a similar thing, which I hope will just emphasize some of the points we've looked at. As I say, I'll be slightly quicker with this one. So if I share the screen, so it takes a moment to get there. Okay, I'll be slightly quicker with this one. As I say, this is just to reiterate some of the points we've looked at before we go just to the final section complete. This is a script from a student. Very, very different. I told you guns are never far away with student scripts, and they're not there by the time we've finished, I can promise you. A large living room reveal Harrison, a middle-aged man dressed in a robe, drinking whiskey by the fireplace. He looks worn out and depressed, throwing wood into the fire. If only I could make things right, you'd have been sitting here with me today. Again, another script about loss and a character missing. Harrison sips his whiskey, the fire builds. He stops throwing logs into the fire, pulls a handgun from his pocket. Harrison then slowly places the gun to the side of his head, trembling as he does so. We start to hear the sound of the crackling fire, pace increase. Camera transitions to immediate close-up. Harrison clocks the trigger and counts down from 5. Camera whips from left to right as we see an off-screen bang, reveal. We hear the director yell, cut, reveal rather, it's a live set. So it's all a set, it's all an act. Oliver, the director, walks over to Harrison, approaches him, says, hey man, that was great. Then reveal in the scene description here, Harrison's head slightly turns to the side to reveal a wound. Oliver looks on in shock. He picks up the gun from Harrison and opens the barrel to reveal that the bullets were not fake. The camera focuses on a medium shot on Oliver as he turns around slowly to his crew. He's dead, says Oliver in shock. Are you surprised he's in shock? The camera pans around to the whole crew and it stops on a man in a black hoodie. We see a close-up of the mysterious man as he holds the fake bullet caps. He disappears into the crowd. Now, I've picked this because it's a nice example of an inciting incident. It's not a very strong inciting incident. We just come in on the scene, so it's a bit loose, but I'll forgive him for that. So the conflict here is that this character is depressed about something, I think because he's missing someone. The resolution is here, not that he shoots himself, but the resolution is here that it's revealed actually that we're just watching a live set. And there is a second conflict at the end of the scene, which is the revelation that the bullets have been swapped in the gun, and actually this man has shot himself for real, and we introduce this new antagonist here at the end. So it's a nice, strong structure here, and I'm just going to very quickly, with the script on screen in front of you, in front of us rather, just have a look at, just run through, and I'm going to do this fairly quickly as it's the last piece. Have a look at the sort of things that a script editor would do to make the intentions of the student, of the author, work more efficiently. So here we go, a large living room night. So we don't need to repeat the fact that it's a large living room, so I'm going to cut that. Okay, less is more. Fewer words you can do, the better. A middle-aged man, reveal Harrison. A middle-aged man dressed in a robe drinking whiskey. He looks worn out and depressed, throwing wood into the fire. Thinking out loud, we lose that because he's obviously thinking out loud. What I really like about this sequence is the color of the fire, which really helps to, is something that a director would really, really work with. He looks worn out and depressed. I'm going to leave the dialogue as it is. Harrison sips his whiskey, fire builds, he stops throwing logs into the fire. We don't need to tell the audience that he stopped an action, so we cut that. He pulls a small handgun from his pocket, places the gun to the side of his head, trembling. Again, I just means that. We start to hear the sound. Again, you don't need that. The sound of the crackling fire increases. Again, this is a nice detail. The fire detail helps build a sense of the drama here. And then the pet hate of any director, the camera transition to a medium close-up, that has been cut there. Do not tell the director how to direct the script. You are the script writer. Any camera directions or camera descriptions there's nothing more guaranteed to annoy a director than camera descriptions. Here's another one. The camera whips from left to right. That is going straight away. There is just an off-screen bang. Harrison clocks the trigger and counts down from 5. I would rather hear that in 5, 4, 3, and we know what counting is like, so I don't need to finish that. So rather than tell the audience in the description that Harrison is counting, I've given that some dialogue, because we would expect Harrison to do that. An off-screen bang might underline that. So you see already this opening is much trimmer, and when you read it, there's just more excitement to it. So the way that the script is laid out is closer to the mood and the tone that the writer is trying to elicit. We hold on the shot. Please get lost. I don't want to know that. Then, if I'm the director, I don't want to be told how to direct it. We hear the director yell cut. Again, don't tell us what the dialogue is. The director shouts cut, and this is quite nice here, so I'm going to put this again. I'm going to underline this. So it's the same detail and the same information in that sequence, just using about 20% of the words. And it's more exciting, it's more dramatic. Harrison clocks a trigger, he starts to count. We can envisage this: 5, 4, 3, an off-screen bang, director yells cut, reveal, it's a live set. So we don't need to know that he approaches in a positive manner. Why not? Because this dialogue itself is incredibly positive. So we don't need to tell the audience, you don't need to double up the emotion, what's already being delivered in the dialogue. This final sequence here, yeah, we can discuss how you know that they're not fake. Again, you know what I'm going to do now. I'm going to remove this scene description. The camera pans around the whole crew. A man in a black hoodie. I don't need a close-up. A man in a black hoodie watches the events from the crowd. He holds fake bullet caps, something like that. It's very, very rough. So that's the same information. It's just, you can see when you read it, your eyes skim over it. A man in a black hoodie watches the events from the crowd. He holds fake bullet caps. This is the second conflict in the scene. And this very strong scene here, because it ends with this second conflict. We're out. We know this. There is now a new piece of information introduced, which is this second character. Who is this man? What is his connection to the film set? Why has he somehow killed this actor Harrison? What is his grudge against Harrison? What has Harrison done wrong? So I'm just going to conclude just by going back to the PowerPoint. If you can see that. I'm just going to conclude just by very, very briefly sort of tying in the themes of what I've talked about this morning, and the exercise that I gave you, this lockdown in 60 seconds or whatever you want to call it. We've looked at 2 examples from students there, and I've applied a couple of the rules of screenplay structure that will help you help the student deliver their intentions more effectively. What we're not doing here is rewriting the script so that it does something different. We're helping the students express themselves more efficiently, get more drama out of the scene. So I asked right at the start, I'm going to ask now, where do stories come from? Because I think the whole experience of the last few months has been intriguing in that we have all, most of us, I would say, very kind of broad, we've all experienced the same thing. We've all been under the same restrictions. Some of us have been alone or with friends or family or whatever our personal circumstances are. We've all faced the same deprivations. We've all lived a very, very similar experience. I can't think of a time in my lifetime when that has ever happened. So we have an opportunity to ask ourselves and our students essentially to interpret the same events. It's like having the same source material, the same short story, and asking them all to do an adaptation of that single story. The advantage here is that the story is their own experience, their own work. Those 2 we looked at just now were both done in response to lockdown in 60 seconds 1. Then they're both about loss and missing, and I gave no instruction or direction other than lockdown in 60 seconds. Talk about your experiences. The student who wrote that story about the film set, obviously this didn't happen. This was a way of them trying to explore their feelings about this whole experience. And what it does show, I think, the exercise so clearly, and this is such a fantastic thing to take away, I think, is that stories come from us as the authors. This is the origin of the stories. The material is very often incidental, and this is proved or shown or illustrated by the fact that you can take the same source material, the same experience that we all have, and you can come up with very, very radically different narratives. Someone comes up with a Norwich match day experience. I've had people write about giant worms and ghost stories, where all sorts of a lot of stories about loss inevitably, but they are all different in their interpretation. That is a really fantastic illustration of this idea of where stories come from. Stories come from us as the author. We own our stories. No one can take your stories away from you. And when you go back, I hope to the workshop in the class, and you encourage students to write about their experiences, they are all starting from the same point, but their interpretation is something that they own. And that is where these great stories come from, whether it's Where's Spot, whether it's Paddington or The Martian. They come from the experience and the interpretation of the author. Stories are not source material. So stories are the interpretation that we put on this material. It's something very, very personal, unique. As you've seen today, when you're working with someone's material, you are trying to preserve their intentions and their aims. What's most precious to them as a storyteller, what you're doing as a script editor, is simply helping them to express those feelings and thoughts more effectively. And I hope today I've given you a couple of clues and a couple of tricks and a sort of inside look really at some of the storytelling, some of the structural elements that we look at, which will help make those stories get told more effectively. I'm going to switch off now and go back, stop sharing the screen and go back to Liv. And Liv, if you want to run any Q&A at this point, anything at all that's come up from the session.
Thanks, Richard. That was really interesting. If anybody does have any questions, as Richard said, anything at all that you'd like to ask, we've got just under 5 minutes really. So do put anything in the chat, or if you'd like to come on and kind of talk to Richard a bit more directly, that's also something we could facilitate. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for any questions to come through, I just wanted to kind of give you a reminder that this is the last session this week, but we do have 4 more sessions next week that you can still book onto. So a really interesting range of activities next week. We've got an insight into user experience design. We've got a talk from Alex Hill, who is the course leader of our FCP and FMB courses, looking at the fashion industry post-COVID and the changes that you as teachers might need to be aware of so that you can best help your students who are interested in applying to any kind of fashion-oriented courses. Oh, so we've had a question here about screenwriting books that you would recommend, Richard.
Red rag to a bull. I'm going to be mean. I'm going to give you the answer that I give to the students, which is, and I'm not being frivolous when I say, I always say to students, if you've got time to read a book about screenwriting, read screenplays instead. Read screenplays. The time it takes to read a book about screenwriting, read 10 screenplays. Go online. Simply Scripts is a great one, particularly around award season. You'll see that they will advertise and make available, particularly for teaching purposes, educational purposes, the screenplays of the films that are up for the awards, and you can access the most amazing network. The reason I say that is because these, particularly in Hollywood, these screenplays, something like Paddington, for example, that's not Hollywood, it's written by Paul King, but something like The Martian, these screenplays are the product of a script factory in a sense. So these rules and structural rules have been applied rigorously to the scripts. They're not pieces of creative writing. They are instruction manuals that allow the production team to create the film. And there's a vast amount you can learn by looking at the way these screenplays are structured. If at that point you've got time to read a screenplay book, I would absolutely recommend John Yorke's Into the Woods. Brilliant book, because he's a script editor and a writer from British TV. He worked on EastEnders. It's very, very accessible, but if you can, I would absolutely encourage you to read it in conjunction with reading screenplays. Definitely fantastic way to learn.
Thanks, Richard. And Amy has said, less of a question, but more of a point I thought you might like to know, that she said it was brilliant and that she'd like to use this as part of an animation project. So this is something we were really hoping for with this workshop, that although you might not be teaching film necessarily, it gives you some pointers to take away and apply to different subject areas. So I don't know, Richard, if you have anything you'd like to add on that point before we go.
Oh, I would absolutely encourage that. I would, if anything, I'd broaden it out. So some students don't like to write, they don't feel comfortable writing, but they've got a phone. We've all got a phone. Take a picture. Take a set of pictures. You know, you take one picture, but that's fine. It's an image. You take 3 pictures, that becomes a narrative. So a lot of students we've done this with, we've said, if you don't want to write, send us some images. So 3 images becomes a story. And you can take these images in the space in your local, in your immediate environment. Some incredibly moving work we had from students. Again, a lot of exploration of empty space. So I would encourage you to do that, to make it accessible for everyone. Not everyone has a phone. Most people have a phone. Most students can at least take pictures, even if they don't want to take moving images. We did also have people who've done 60-second postcards where they've sat and they've recorded the sound of the space that they've been in for 3 months. Again, I'd love to see the results of that. Animation would be a terrific way. Again, start from the script. Animation, I would just say, broaden it so that students don't necessarily feel that they just have to submit something written. Lots of students feel much happier delivering in a visual medium, and why not? That's what film is, a visual medium primarily.
Great, thanks, Richard. So I think that's all we've got time for, really. I don't think we've had any other questions, but you can always email us at student.recruitment@nua.ac.uk if you do have any other questions, and we'll get those answered for you. But otherwise, thank you, Richard, for giving up your time to deliver this, and hopefully I'll be seeing more of you all next week for the remaining workshops in this series. But otherwise, thank you very much and enjoy the sunshine.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for listening. Great. Good luck. Good luck telling your stories.
Thanks. Bye.